What if the destiny of India wasn't written in London, but in Paris? Picture a world where the revolutionary ideals of France, not the cautious pragmatism of Britain, were forced upon the subcontinent. This is the story of how a French-colonized India could have been born from constant war, creating a political fate far more brutal than the one we know. Back in the mid-18th century, India was a chaotic chessboard of collapsing empires and ambitious European powers. The once mighty Mughal Empire was crumbling, leaving a power vacuum that both the British and French were desperate to fill. And for a moment, it really looked like the French would win. Their Governor-General, Joseph-François Dupleix, was a master of diplomacy and strategy. He built alliances with local rulers, adapted to Indian politics, and dreamed of a French empire stretching across the subcontinent. He was aggressive, he was a visionary, and for a while he seemed unstoppable, even capturing the key British fort of Madras in 1746. In our history, Dupleix's ambition was stopped dead in its tracks. A mix of British naval power, the genius of Robert Clive, and a lack of real support from a French crown distracted by wars in Europe sealed his fate. Dupleix was called back to France in 1754, and his dream of a French India became little more than a historical what-if. But what if that didn't happen? What if Paris, seeing the incredible prize at stake, had actually gone all in on Dupleix's plan? What if a key battle had gone the other way? Right there, that's our turning point. A world where French ambition, not British commerce, conquers India. And the consequences? They wouldn't just reshape a subcontinent, they would redraw the map of the entire world. A French victory in southern India wouldn't have meant a peaceful transition of power. It would have kicked off a much more violent chapter in Indian history. The British East India Company slowly expanded its power through a mix of trade, treaties, and military threats. The French approach, however, was geared toward direct, aggressive military conquest. Dupleix's strategy was to put territorial expansion ahead of commercial interests. With the British pushed out of the south, Dupleix would have aimed for the rest of India. This wouldn't have been a slow creep. His strategy suggested a rapid campaign. Using his alliances with Indian princes and a tough army of French and Indian soldiers, Dupleix would have tried to exploit the fractures of the Mughal Empire, sparking constant, bloody wars. The Marathas, the Rajput states, the Sikhs, all would have faced a relentless French military that wasn't interested in the long game of political manipulation the way the British were. The French conquest of India might have looked more like Napoleon's European campaigns than the slow, piece-by-piece expansion of the British Raj. Cities would be besieged, armies crushed, and local rulers who fought back would be brutally replaced. At their core, the British were merchants who became rulers. The French in this timeline are conquerors from the start. Their goal isn't just about profit, it's about imperial glory and seizing a rival's greatest potential prize. This constant warfare would have been devastating for the people of India. It would have meant decades of instability, with armies marching across the land, ruining agriculture, and bleeding local kingdoms dry. The French, unlike the British, had less interest in keeping old local institutions around. Their instinct would be to sweep aside traditional power structures and impose their own centralized authority, putting French governors in charge. This would have created deep resentment from the very beginning. The conquest of India wouldn't be a quiet story of contracts and deals, it would be a story written in blood. Once the subcontinent was unified under the French flag, colonial rule would have felt profoundly different from the British Raj. The key difference comes down to a philosophy of governance: British indirect rule versus French direct rule and assimilation. The British mostly tried to rule through existing power structures. They kept the princely states, left many local customs alone, and treated their colonial subjects as just that: subjects who were separate from British citizens. The French, on the other hand, often pushed a policy of cultural assimilation. Their stated goal was to turn colonial populations into French citizens, or citoyens. In Langue Française, this would have created a fascinating but deeply divided society. A small, educated Indian elite would be encouraged to learn French and adopt French culture and laws. They'd be granted French citizenship, a status the British never offered their Indian subjects. These Franco-Indian elites would study in Paris, work in the colonial government, and see themselves as part of a global French empire. French, not English, would become the language of power and education. But this assimilation policy was a double-edged sword. It was often just a thin cover for a rigid hierarchy. While the British were often criticised for their racism and segregation, the French system created a different kind of division, a cultural one. Those who assimilated were rewarded, but the vast majority who held onto their own traditions, languages, and religions would be seen as backwards and needing to be civilized. The French revolutionary principle of laïcité, or state secularism, could have eventually led to aggressive policies aimed at reducing the influence of Hinduism and Islam in public life, something the British largely avoided for practical reasons. The administration would also be totally different. Where the British had a decentralized system, France would have likely imposed a single, highly centralized government run directly from Paris. The hundreds of princely states the British kept as self-governing vassals, they may well have been abolished, their rulers pensioned off and their lands absorbed into one colonial entity. This might have unified the region under one government, but it would be a unity created by force, erasing centuries of regional identity. This system, offering a few the prize of becoming French while alienating everyone else, would plant the seeds for a uniquely violent and ideological fight for independence. A French-run India wouldn't just change India, it would completely alter world history. In the 18th and 19th centuries, India was the engine of the British Empire. Its resources and manpower funded Britain's industrial revolution and its global dominance. Handing that engine to France turns the global balance of power completely upside down. Without India's wealth, the British Empire as we know it might never have happened. Its power to fight wars and control global trade would be crippled. Think about the Napoleonic Wars. They would play out very differently. Napoleon, instead of being choked off by a dominant British global economy, would have access to the riches of India. Indian soldiers or sepoys wouldn't be fighting for the British across the globe. They might be fighting for Napoleon in Russia. The outcome of those wars could be reversed, possibly leaving France as the master of Europe. The ripple effects would keep going. A weaker Britain would have a harder time holding onto colonies like Canada or Australia. The scramble for Africa might have been led by a dominant France, with Britain as a junior partner. It's not a stretch to imagine French becoming the world's language of commerce and diplomacy instead of English. The world wars of the 20th century would be unrecognizable. The alliances, the economic powers, everything would be rearranged. A French empire backed by Indian resources would be an incredible force, potentially changing the outcome of both World War I and World War II. Even the United States' role would shift. Without a powerful British partner, America's rise to superpower status might have happened faster or taken a completely different path. The world would simply look, sound, and feel different. For Britain, losing India isn't just losing a colony, it's losing its empire. For France, gaining India isn't just gaining a colony, it's the key to ruling the world. The fight for Indian independence from France would have been nothing like the movement led by Mahatma Gandhi. It would almost certainly have been a brutal, long, and incredibly violent war. We can see the historical precedent for this in France's other colonial conflicts, especially the Algerian War of Independence. French colonial policy was famously stubborn when it came to independence. Colonies like Algeria weren't seen as possessions but as integral parts of France. France overseas. This meant that any independence movement wasn't a political negotiation. It was seen as treason. The French response was often extreme military force. In our alternate timeline, an Indian independence movement would rise up, inspired by the very French ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité that were taught in schools but denied to most people. But this movement wouldn't find a partner to negotiate with in Paris. It would find an enemy dead set on holding onto the jewel in its imperial crown at any cost. The conflict could have become a nationwide guerrilla war. Instead of marches and boycotts, the story of Indian independence would be one of ambushes and brutal reprisals. The French army, with its history of counterinsurgency in places like Indochina and Algeria, would deploy its tactics across India. Villages could be targeted and torture could become a common tool. The war would engulf the entire nation, pitting Indian nationalists against a French army, an army that would include the assimilated Franco-Indian elite, who would face an impossible crisis of loyalty. The British, for all their cruelty, eventually saw that Indian independence was politically inevitable and began a slow, flawed transfer of power. This process, despite ending in the tragedy of partition, at least left behind some groundwork for a democratic state. The French system of direct rule, with its refusal to build up local self-governing institutions, risked leaving no such foundation. Power would only be surrendered after a devastating war that would leave millions dead and the country in ruins. Independence wouldn't be granted. It would be won at a terrible, bloody price. An India born from a brutal war against France would be a nation shaped by trauma, completely different from the democracy that emerged in 1947. The lack of experience with self-government and the violent birth of the nation would likely lead to a future of extreme political instability, military rule, and even fragmentation. In our timeline, the British left behind a framework of administrative institutions and a parliamentary system that the new Indian government could adapt. A French departure after a horrific war, however, would likely leave a power vacuum. The leaders of the independence movement would probably be military commanders, not politicians. As we've seen in many countries that endured violent freedom struggles, the military often sees itself as the only thing capable of holding the nation together. So it's easy to see a future where post-colonial India doesn't become the world's largest democracy. Instead, it could fall under the control of a military junta or an authoritarian leader promising stability after decades of war. Democratic ideals would be a distant dream, something to be fought for all over again. The unity of the subcontinent would also be at risk. The centralized French rule, which suppressed regional identities, would likely cause a violent backlash once they left. Without established political structures to manage disputes, India could balkanize. We might see an independent Bengal, a sovereign Sikh state in the Punjab, and multiple Dravidian nations in the south, all fighting for power in a chaotic post-colonial free-for-all. The brutal suppression under French rule would give way to an equally brutal era of internal conflict. The cultural landscape would be permanently changed, and the economy would be a disaster. A war of independence would have destroyed the country's infrastructure, leaving the new Indian state or states impoverished and dependent on foreign aid, perhaps even from a neo-colonial France trying to maintain its influence. In short, a French-colonized India might have traded a future of challenging but democratic development for a legacy of authoritarianism, fragmentation, and endless conflict. Conclusion. From the bold dreams of Joseph-François Dupleix to a potential 21st century scarred by authoritarian rule, the story of a French-colonized India is a powerful reminder of how one single moment can create a completely different world. A switch from British to French rule would have meant so much more than just a change in language. It would have meant a history defined by more intense and longer wars from the very start. It would have meant a society built on direct assimilation instead of indirect rule, creating a whole new set of social fault lines. And most critically, it likely would have ended in a decolonization process that looked more like the bloody wars in Algeria or Indochina, not a political transfer of power. The result would probably not be a stable, unified democracy, but a fractured subcontinent struggling under military rule, born from a fire of non-stop violence. Would a French-Indian alliance have created a more just world or one locked in perpetual conflict? That's a question worth debating. So, what do you think? Would a French India have led to a more fractured and violent world? Or could there have been some unforeseen benefits we haven't considered? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy exploring these alternate timelines, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next trip into the world of what ifs.